We've just finished day 9 of the Undercover Policing Inquiry, Tranche 2, Phase 1. We've spent the afternoon listening to the live evidence of Jane Hickman. This morning it was Hilary Moore. Before that, we had the introduction of evidence of Rebecca Johnson, who joins me now.
Hi.
What do you think of today's hearing?
Absolutely a travesty in so many ways. If the inquiry actually is trying to find out about the, whether the undercover policing of Greenham was ever useful, because all they're interested in looking at is one of the two that originally Geoffrey Craft, a senior police officer,
Who gave evidence in Tranche 1.
Gave evidence in that, which that's the only one I went to in Tranche 1. But
Phase 3 last week.
He talked about, that suddenly there was Greenham Common. They already had somebody in CND, but there was Greenham Common, and they suddenly realised they couldn't get any information about that, and they needed to get, in his words, 2 lady cops.
Yeah.
And that went unchallenged. It was clearly he talked about 2, and I've seen that written in a book as well. And then they're admitting only to 1 who didn't actually spy on Greenham.
Right, yeah,
She spied on a very small, lovely group of women from Lambeth called Lambeth Women for Peace, who got together as part of the they met on sort of coaches going down to Greenham in 1982 and set up. A number of them were involved in other kinds of important kind of peace things like anti-apartheid, very much sort of part of it. And they got together to support, Greenham and to go to Greenham and were part of sort of, the exchange of information that went between Greenham and, as Hilary said in her evidence this morning, carry Greenham home to Lambeth. She said, that's where that phrase, carry Greenham home, we started it at Greenham because we were doing actions, but we wanted women to take everything back to where they lived, because this was about nuclear weapons. And I know the UK had nuclear weapons, and indeed Greenham went on to do a lot of stuff at Aldermaston. We found it. I was one of the 3 women that actually got together at Greenham and said, let's go and camp at Aldermaston, at least for a weekend. You didn't want to spend too long there with the plutonium. But it was a new generation of the American nuclear-armed first-use cruise missiles from ground, land-based launchers that NATO decided on in 1979. A bunch of Welsh women brilliantly decided they'd walk all the way from Cardiff to Greenham, and then they chained themselves to the gates because they weren't being listened to, and that's how the women's peace camp at Greenham Common got started. Here we are, more than 40 years later, and we're having to hear that the Met Police setting up this special demonstration squad chose a youngish woman who had done a couple of other things for them, and approached her and said...
Well, it was just interesting. She was a plainclothes officer within Special Branch, attending a CND demonstration.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Something that a lot of activists don't really understand is that when we talk about the Spycops, we're not talking about plainclothes police going on demonstrations. That happens beyond the undercover police. There's a bigger layer of covert policing that goes beyond just the SDS officers or the APORU officers. And she was one of them, and there's quite a lot of those.
And by her evidence, she was then approached, having done something at a CND demonstration, she was then approached and told that Margaret Thatcher wanted to know what Greenham women were up to. And this was in 1983. Well, you'd have thought she might want to know that even before that, but there we are, 1983. And she was directly asked, according to her own witness statement, would you like to help do that? Well, of course she said yes. And then she chose Lambeth Women for Peace because she didn't want to go and camp out at Greenham in all weathers and put up with everything that we put up. Now, I still think there was at least one undercover police, if not several, probably in rotation from the CIA, quite apart from. But anyway, this is not what this inquiry is looking at. So this inquiry is trying to focus trying to think about Greenham through the lens of a lovely group that couldn't live at Greenham, that had jobs, had families, had, you know, other things that they were holding down, but who were part of the women's peace movement, linked issues like anti-racism, anti-apartheid with Greenham and Women for Peace, and you know, all of those sorts of things, and took, you know, and wanted, you know, got involved. This is you know, this is a citizen's obligation, particularly when you're facing nuclear weapons that can blow the entire world up.
Sure. One of the most common things that Hilary Moore said during her questioning this morning was, "I don't know. You should ask Rebecca Johnson that." We were sat near each other at the back of the room, and like it was, you know, I kept looking over at you because your name was being mentioned so many times.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something we saw last week or week before, the other week in at the inquiry with. When we were hearing the evidence from Steve Sorber from Freedom Press, where they kept mentioning Dave McCabe, who was sat in the room.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was...
And I've been sat in the room,
right.
And I'd you know, written a fairly comprehensive statement that dealt with Greenham Common, dealt with our relationship with a number of the groups. I personally probably knew some of the women in Hackney and Camden Greenham group, because they also did quite a bit more cruise watching type stuff when 1984 came. But nevertheless, you know, and then also how that played into us setting up Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp, which is going to be in tranche 3 or even 4, having been spied on then.
Sure.
So, you know, there was all of that I took the trouble to start actually for the first time going through my my documents and doing this, only to be told a few weeks ago, oh, the inquiry is not going to be calling you to give evidence. And then half the questions asked to Hilary were questions I could have easily answered. It's the same thing with Monday, that we had Kate Hudson, who's the current General Secretary and has been for a number of years, General Secretary of CND, but was not involved in CND at all during the 1980s. And so could only be asked questions. She was politically active, absolutely, but not with CND. And so couldn't answer any of the questions they were really asking, except as a historian. And they ended up admitting that and actually saying, well, as a historian. And she did a terrific job. She was very calm and collected and just emphasised the things that also Hilary emphasised, which is completely non-violent. Obviously, CND was much more hierarchical. Greenham, as part of the feminist peace movement, was very much about, as we heard from Hilary, personal political responsibility rests with all of us. And we'd made, after the beginnings of Greenham and the big 35,000 women embrace the base of December 1982, we deliberately started saying, carry Greenham home, and Greenham women are everywhere, to actually emphasise, we recognise not everybody could live at the camp, and it was often very hard then. Obviously, this HN33, I'm sorry, I don't want to call her the name Lee Bonser. She took that from a dead child, and that makes me so... I was so upset when I read that, and this was not her. This was the name of a child that she used. So I call her HN33 because that's that code number. But she clearly didn't want to actually do anything. Certainly not anything uncomfortable like an actual women's peace activist would do. She essentially went into this group and then tried to understand from that. So a lot of her reports were either anodyne or you know, wrong.
Yeah, I mean,
in so many ways. She got the politics wrong in so many ways, and seems to have included people in, you know, the lists of people who were there who weren't actually there for certain kinds of meetings for whatever purpose. But this is not a reason to, you know, she went to people's homes for meetings. And, you know, Lambeth Women for Peace, as Hilary said really, really clearly, and I think Jane said at the end of her statement, should never have been spied on. But so shouldn't all of us.
Right.
I mean, all of us who were engaged in peace and justice, activism, non-violently, committed to non-violence, we we were part of the democratic process. You know, this thing that was called Rebecca Johnson's introduction or statement or something was not my statement.
Sure.
I never saw or heard that statement until it was read out this morning by a lawyer for the inquiry. It was the inquiry lawyer's summary of what they thought was important to say today from my quite long and much more comprehensive, and even that I left lots of things out. You always do.
That should be available now on the the UCPI website.
My whole statement now. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Because it really troubled me as Hilary started speaking. She kept referring to, you know, what had been read on my behalf, as if that was something I'd written. I'm not saying necessarily that it wasn't correct. It just that it was not the emphasis I would have given. It did not have the priorities I would have put for certain things. Maybe that's why they wanted to control that. So it was a very odd introduction that was supposed to be based on a statement that had actually raised a lot of questions about, you know, how did this happen? You know, how did these things get decided? Also mentioned, I stood in the general election of 1983 against Michael Heseltine.
I mean, just quickly on that, was something that came out very strongly yesterday when we heard the evidence of HN65 about the political reporting, really, that the lead up to the 83 election. And it wasn't really touched on that much today, but I think it's really important. I mean, particularly when we talk about why, like you said earlier, why did Thatcher suddenly want to know about Greenham Common in 83? For a while. It's because there was an election coming.
But also because cruise missiles were highly unpopular in Britain. You know, when opinion polls were taken, loads of people who'd never been active, you know, who were much younger generation like I was then, who'd not gone on Aldermaston marches or anything like that, although I think one of my eldest sisters did. But, you know, they came out to stop that latest generation of death machines. And then to try to roll back the ones that we'd almost... It was almost as if we'd been lulled after the comprehensive... or after the you know, there were a couple of treaties in the 60s that kind of dealt with non-proliferation and banning certain kinds of nuclear tests, but not all of them. And then 79 and this NATO decision, and the Soviets on their side were deploying their version of the ground-launched cruise, the SS-20s. And suddenly, you know, we just felt, we can't let this carry on. We have to draw a line, and now's the place to draw the line. That's what loads of people said out there. And I think that's why Thatcher had, you know, she'd done the Falklands War, and she had initially, I think, thought that had secured her future in an election, and as it turned out, maybe that was. But what she was getting was intelligence from opinion polls and things that CND was getting larger, and for every person who ever joined CND at that time, and I didn't join CND until 84, but I was an activist. I got an activist through the feminist, you know, peace movement. But for anyone who joined CND, you could imagine that there were probably at least 20 who thought exactly as and were doing things in their own communities, like Lambeth Women for Peace.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, there was over 100,000 members of CND at this time, so we're talking
it
about
really,
a significantly
it really
large
grew. But it really grew mainly about the cruise missiles. It was Thatcher who was worried about the general election. In fact, that was the critical thing, and that's what we were hearing about. And of course, as we know, and in my statement, you know, I'd put in some stuff about. And the reason why I stood against Michael Heseltine, in fact, I was in prison for the dancing on the silos, and a couple of lovely women from Henley, which was the constituency of Michael Heseltine, who was the Secretary of Defence, appointed on the 6th of January of 1983, when essentially John Knott was forced to resign, so that Thatcher could get somebody in who was much more likely to do what she wanted, which was set up this thing called DS-19, which was a sort of unit within the Ministry of Defence for dirty tricks on CND and on Greenham women. And we know that. That's now of public record. It's been written about in various books. This is, you know, no secret. And I attached to my statement some of of the stuff that related to it, and I did write about it. But it was because he then began to engage not on, intelligence that led to anything about security in Britain, but on stuff on individuals doing peace and justice work that could be used in the media, and the tabloid media in particular. And none of this really came out today whatsoever. And yet in our statements, it's a really important part of the questions that we're asking the inquiry to look at, because it's a complete abuse and misuse of any kind of intelligence gathering, that it be held, in and used in a way that is really about smearing, honest, activists just trying to engage in the political process in a way that gets attention for decisions on, in this case, deployment of nuclear weapons, and is making the links with things like anti-apartheid, because that link was through uranium being mined in Namibia and the Rossing mine in South Africa under apartheid, Rio Tinto Zinc, now called RTZ. That's one reason why a couple of years into Greenham, 3 of us went off and founded a weekend peace camp at Aldermaston to be able to focus more on the Trident program and the nuclear colonialism embedded in the nuclear testing done on behalf of the UK getting its nuclear weapons and keeping its nuclear weapons, and the fact that we did a lot of stuff at South Africa House, protesting jointly about for peace and against the mining of uranium at all, because it's such a contaminating, dirty trade, and the racism at the heart of the way in which the British government and RTZ were doing the mining of uranium, which at that time could be done for nuclear weapons, because South Africa hadn't signed any treaty that said they couldn't. And these are all the links we were making in the 1980s that should be coming out, but these were legitimate things we were doing. That's the point. And most of the civil society groupings, whether I agreed with them or not at the time is not what's material here. What they were doing was engaging in political processes that were completely legal. They were engaging, by and large, pretty openly. I mean, so much has been said about leaflets, and, we were wanting to get the message out. Peace camp on Clapham Common, to raise awareness that Clapham Common itself would be turned into a mass graveyard, a mass burial ground, if there was anybody left to bury anybody, after a nuclear war, after nuclear bombs fired from the UK and also into the UK. But there was a logic to the choices that activists were making about various places that they chose to leaflet and picket and to raise awareness. But through nonviolence, we were being so creative and, in raising awareness. But a whole lot of things are not being addressed here, because there's one HN33 person who pretended she was an estate agent, used as her cover line, that she had been abused in a relationship.
Yeah, there's a very common
to
thing.
Get sympathy, which she got.
I mean, it's a very common thing we see from a lot of the undercover officers, the use of trauma, essentially, as cover build, as both as like legend building, but also in order to get close to people, because you trauma bonding. Right? This is clearly a tactic that was used.
Whereas actually, of course, the violence was being committed in so many cases by different agents of state, whether of the US or the British, we don't know, and I don't think this inquiry is willing to look into. But for certain, uniformed and undercover, and non-uniformed police within quite a lot of the actions that were taking place, and And so a big question for us is, clearly you were not getting, this undercover policing was not providing information that could be of any use for them to make policing safer or better for public order, or this kept coming up, public order, and all of these things. This was not the way. We were circulating our leaflets widely on anything that was going to involve, any significant number. Often, and it came up again today, letting the local council where something was happening know, and trying to obtain permission, and it was all about awareness raising, all about, if people were going to be voting, for them to know what it was that was at stake. That's why I stood against Heseltine in Henley, was to use that position, and yet when they made the summary, they didn't even mention that.
I mean, it was very telling, a lot of the reports, everything, all the information in it, as was quite well pointed out, I think, by the Council for the Inquiry with the questioning, was information that was publicly available.
Yeah.
And then there was attachments of the leaflets, which again were publicly available. The only information which was in them, which
lazy,
wasn't public,
quite apart from anything else.
But what's telling is the information that wasn't publicly available that was in it was the names, the addresses, the telephone numbers. All that, the descriptions, all that personal private information, which we see as the hallmark really of how the SDS operated. They're collecting these long lists, which are then later used for blacklisting, for vetting.
But also potentially the car things. I started off with a motorbike, but then in about my second year at Greenham, I had a car, and when I had a car, it kept being attacked in a variety of different kinds of ways, some of which were potentially life-threatening. And how many other cars, my car was certainly broken into on 2 or 3 occasions, that were occasions when, through intelligence, they might possibly have known where I was going to be at the time, and so on and so forth. When I was, going to speak about Greenham and Cruise Watch, for example, at a major conference in Coventry that was END, so it was involving a lot of internationals and CND together, that conference, things like that, but also at Greenham, at the camp. So, car numbers were important to them. But who did they share those car numbers with, and for what purpose? At Greenham, we were attacked by vigilantes, for example. And, timing of certain kinds of things definitely appears to suggest that there was some kind of cahoots going on between DS19 and local vigilantes at Greenham and media.
As we've said many times on this channel and on other on podcasts or whatever, this inquiry really gives us opportunity to see a very, very small glimpse into a very small part of the wider infrastructure of repression that exists in this country. The British state has many ways of repressing dissent. The Spycops is just one part of it. And like you say, there's all sorts of dirty tricks that go on, all sorts of different parts of the state which are trying to stop protest and activism.
And it's actually, if anything, it's getting worse and worse. I mean, that's something else we have to understand. I mean, when we were at Greenham in the early 80s, almost the only thing they could do when we went into the base or we went onto the silos was either cosh us with an Official Secrets Act, but then they had to show some kind of an intention, or breach of the peace, a 600-year-old kind of, the blokes getting drunk in the village and misbehaving, or whatever it was, Then they brought in bylaws, which actually they brought in illegally. So then and quite a lot of women at Greenham actually were arrested, prosecuted, and even sent to prison for offences on bylaws that went up to the House of Lords and were shown to have been actually completely misconceived and illegal. But then they brought in PACE, and I thought that, the police and criminal evidence. Now, interestingly, we were very concerned about it, but there was a period of time when actually the fact that they had to keep records of, when they had us in custody, allowed us to actually challenge when they lied in court because there it was on their own records and things like that. But now they're bringing in this notion of they constantly keep asking us about, as if to be political at all is to be an extremist.
Sure.
And then they actually explicitly started to call. I know this is one of the things used against Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp, domestic extremists. We were ordinary women still trying to get rid of nuclear weapons in the most, actively peaceful way, in the sense that we did disrupt the military, but we did it without using violence, and that was critical to us. And I think we were very effective about that. And then to be called domestic extremists, I mean, really.
I'm very aware we're going to get chucked out of this building soon.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about today's hearing before we go?
Just that I just want to pay massive tribute to Hilary Moore, who spoke this morning, and Jane Hickman, who spoke this afternoon, because the timelines have been so tight. Everybody had to put so much work into it. I'm personally very frustrated that I was debarred from speaking for myself and answering questions, but I'm so glad we had some wonderful, strong women who were at least able to put themselves out to engage in this process and help to get some of the information out there. But none of us should have been spied on. And I hope that the inquiry really clearly recognises that this was a waste of public resources. We had Jane actually talking about, as a lawyer, that, at the time that they were spending, a load of money on the undercover police officers and their overtime and, and then buying rounds and goodness knows what else and running cars and things like that. Actually, they were taking legal aid away progressively until we're now at a situation where hardly anybody...
I mean, it basically doesn't exist now,
Yeah,
right?
and they took legal aid away from Greenham women by about, fairly early in 1984. It became almost impossible. And then we had to represent ourselves and ask for legal advice, knowing that we couldn't pay for the lawyers who were going to do that. But we also had lawyers who were willing just to share their knowledge with us in meetings like Lambeth Women for Peace meetings. That was also really important. And, I don't know. So what I just want to say is it is getting worse, but we've got to get everything we can out of this inquiry to say, ask the questions and stop the abuse of power by the state, and where it's also an abuse of power by individual and police forces, find out the truth. That's why I joined. I'm 69 now, and I just want to know the truth about what happened, and I hope the inquiry at least delves in enough to tell a bit of that truth. I wish they would tell it all, because I know there is an all out there.
Sure. Well, thanks for joining me for this
Thank
recap.
you.
And thanks for watching. This is the last day of the hearings this week. We're back on Monday with HN25. Use the cover name Kevin Douglas, followed by Lindsay German. Be great if you can join us then. I'll be doing the Twitter Spaces later on, recapping today. But cheers for now.